Remember the first time you tried grass-fed beef? You were so excited. You thought, all right, I'm eating a highly nutritious cut of meat. And then you bit into it and it was tough and it was stringy and it wasn't what you expected. It wasn't that beef that you're accustomed to. Well, today we're going to talk about why that might have been and what you can do to change that. And this is going to go beyond just how you prepare the meat. There's a couple of other things that you need to know about well before you ever get into preparing that cut of beef, the grass-fed beef, that have a huge influence on how that meat actually tastes and the texture of that meat. Hey guys, I'm Dr. Arland Hill out at Harvest Hills Ranch, and I appreciate you joining me today. And I'm looking forward to sharing this information with you because it probably hasn't crossed your radar, but it actually has a big impact on the beef that you select, especially if you're choosing grass-fed beef. Now, this is relevant because oftentimes we hear, well, grass-fed beef, we talk about the nutritional aspects of it, differences in the fat ratios and these types of things. But let's be honest, guys, it has to taste good. It has to have good texture. And if it doesn't meet those two criteria first, it's really hard to get past that. And you often will go back to eating more conventional meat, which still has a great nutritional profile, but there are some things that we can do to improve it on the grass-fed side. So how do we get that same texture and the consistency in the meat that we're often familiar with animals that are finished out on grains, more specifically corn? But there's other things there along the way as well, but mostly corn. So here's a couple of things we need to think about. Well, these animals that are fed on corn are going through a feedlot system. And what is actually taking place when they're in that feedlot system? Well, these animals aren't very active. They're pretty much within the area that they have to eat within, the bunks or I'll just say cell areas, right? They're not confined and constricted to little small tight areas, but they don't have room to roam and to forage across pastures like they normally do, right? So they're not highly mobile is probably really the point of that statement. They're not highly mobile. And they're gaining fat, they're gaining weight, right? The weight that they're gaining is fat, along with the muscle tissue. But the important part there is there's fat, and that's the reason that they're given the corn. They're given a certain percentage of their diet as corn because that's going to increase the marbling in the fat without disrupting the digestive system of the animal. It can't cross a certain threshold on the animal without disrupting the rumen there. But not to digress into another topic. So fat accumulation is what we're interested in here. Well, how do we meet those same criteria on the grass-fed side? And this is what it really comes down to, and I always say this in my videos, and this one's no different. You really have to know who you're interacting with, because there's a couple of things that are important that relate to the grass-fed and finished beef versus conventional. And the first is that when we're looking to finish an animal, we don't want to finish that animal when their nutritional status is in a state of decline. So what does that look like in reality? Well, if you think about the normal yearly cycles, the seasons of the year, when it is going to be most difficult on an animal is when the seasons are most extreme, in the winter and in the extreme summer. For example, in the winter, we're looking at mostly stored forages, stored grasses, hay, silage, these types of things that an animal might be fed, the cattle might be fed. And then down in Texas, where I'm at, when we get into the heat of the summer, especially late summer, the grasses just don't have the same quality to them. Well, what about the spring and the fall? Well, in the spring and the fall, those grasses are much higher quality. They're, especially in the spring, we get what's called the spring flush. We have the lush grasses in the fall as well, and there's just better palatability at that time. The animals are consuming more forage, and so at that point, they're on an increase in their nutritional plane, and that means they're gaining weight, right? They're not coming down, they're gaining weight. That is specifically relevant to when we process the animal. Here at Harvest Hills Ranch, and we've done this for several years now. I think there was only 1 year that we didn't follow this very early on, but this has been our pattern for several years now, is that we process in early to mid-June, and then we process again in mid to late October. So that's bringing us right out of that real rich spring lush. And then it's also, again, when we're back into the fall and the grasses have started to pick up a bit again, and the animals are increasing on their nutritional plane. So those are the times. So relevant to your taste in accumulating that fat, it matters as to when that animal is processed if it's grass-fed. If it's an animal that's conventionally raised, it's irrelevant, right? Because you've got they are in the same system all the time, and their environment doesn't change a whole lot. Their environment is controlled for a specific reason, and it produces a good tasting quality meat, but we also can accomplish that on the grass-fed and finishing side if we finish that animal at the right time. So that's one thing you need to know about this. The other thing is, I mentioned that these animals aren't highly mobile. So they're staying in a relatively limited area that they have space to move in. So we try to accomplish the same thing, but we do it with a completely different philosophy. We're not confining the animals. The animals are on pasture, right? But we keep the animals in a tight herd, and we keep them constantly moving. But if they're in the tight herd, and most importantly, they're constantly moving, what that means is that those animals aren't running around. They're interacting with us, and they're accustomed to interacting with Leah and I every day. And as a result of that, they're used to being around us. Nearly all of our cows I can walk up to at any time and put my hands on that animal, and that animal most of the time doesn't think a whole lot about it. So you've got a very calm animal. A very calm animal going into the finishing process is more ideal than an animal who's running around and who has a lot. They're excitable. Our animals aren't excitable to that nature. They're very calm. They're very docile. And that translates into them being in a relaxed state, accumulating that fat in the meat and allowing that marbling to be present. So that plays a factor in this story as well. So those are just a few things I wanted to share with you, just that you can ask the producer maybe that you're looking to interact with is, when do you finish your animals? Timing of the year of when you finish that animal does matter. And then tell me about how you interact with those animals. You know, what's the disposition of the overall herd and of the animals that you're finishing? How does that play into this? And then also, as far as the plane of nutrition, when is the forage that animal has, are they on a steady upward gain when they're being processed and when they're harvested, or have they started to fall off and decline? Because if they started to fall off and decline, that is going to change the flavor and the taste on the meat. The other thing too is that when we talk about flavor, we know that richness really comes from the fats, and so we have those high energy plants in the spring and in the fall, and so that's going to translate into greater fat accumulation on the animal. So a couple of things to think about. And then of course, you know, just to go more so after you've purchased the meat, remember that when you're looking to when you're looking to prepare grass-fed and finished meat, it's always important to note that there is typically some difference there. You don't want to overcook the meats. That's important. Leah and I often have to tell, especially new customers, hey, make sure that you're keeping an eye on this. On this grass-fed and finished beef, it does tend to cook faster on some cuts. So that's always something for consideration as well. So just thought I'd share that with you guys. There's a few things that I was looking at for us at this time of year. We're getting ready to start thinking about processing animals in the next 2 months. So I wanted to, as I thought about this, I thought I'd share these ideas with you because I thought maybe you haven't heard this type of stuff when it comes to selecting grass-fed and finished beef, and it's important for you to know. So anyway, until next time, guys, come on back out and join us, and we'll talk to you soon. I'm Dr. Arland Hill out at Harvest Hills Ranch. Take care.